Welcome to Fantasy Cartography, the show where we see what maps can teach us about fantasy and what fantasy can teach us about maps. On today's episode, we're considering the question of how to cross the Misty Mountains. Shall we take the Gap of Rohan, the Pass of Caradhras, or the Mines of Moria? And what's the geology behind each of those three choices? This is a little bit of an experimental episode. For one thing, it's a sort of sequel to episode 3. For another, it's part 1 of a 2-part episode. I'm going to try very hard to make each of these episodes independent, so you can watch them in any order. You see, in episode 3, I talked about how mountains are formed and the shapes that they make. In this 2-parter, I'm going to take a closer look at the geology and geography of mountain crossing. There's an iconic moment in The Fellowship of the Ring, by which I mean the film, where the Fellowship must choose between 3 possible routes across the Misty Mountains. Their options are the Gap of Rohan, the Pass of Caradhras, and the Mines of Moria. Of course, the book spread this decision out over 30 pages and added a couple of extra options which were ruled out by the weather and the movement of orcish armies because Tolkien. I'm going to be sticking with the film version here because the 3 options presented there are good representations of the 3 different ways that you can cross a mountain range. You can find a pass and go around the mountains, you can follow the ridgelines and go over the mountains, or you can find a cave and go underneath the mountains. All 3 of those options have some interesting geography behind them, and over the course of the next 2 episodes, we're going to examine all 3. So first of all, let's look at mountain passes. A mountain pass is a navigable route through the low point of a mountain range. Strictly speaking, any gap between 2 mountains could be considered a navigable pass for a given value of navigable, but we usually think of them as being wide enough and flat enough to drive a road through. There are a few different ways that passes can form, but large road navigable passes are almost always formed by some kind of flowing water. One way that passes can form is when there are 2 streams on opposite sides of a mountain. When rain falls above the head of a mountain stream, it erodes away at that ground slightly, making the stream longer. If you looked at the stream in a year-by-year time-lapse, it would look like the head of the stream was crawling up the mountain. If this were to happen on both sides of a mountain, then the erosion could bring the 2 streams together and they combine into a single river, which would erode into the mountain at a reasonable pace. This is something which can happen but isn't especially likely. The thing is that mountains pull water out of the air. As rain-bearing clouds approach a mountain range, the increased elevation makes the rain fall, creating a phenomenon called a rain shadow. That means that one side of the mountain range will see a lot more rain than the other, and thus it'll have a lot more streams. So you aren't likely to get this double stream kind of pass unless both sides of the mountain are exposed to water-bearing winds. A few of them can be found in England or Japan, which are of course long, narrow and fairly rainy islands, but you aren't likely to find them on larger continents because one side will almost always be in a rain shadow. The more common way you'll find a river flowing through a mountain pass is when the river was already there and the mountains were uplifted around it. The river will increase in speed, which leads to rapid erosion, and the river will cut its way through the mountains. This kind of mountain pass is called a water gap. Water gaps are incredibly common in North America, and some examples can be found on every continent except for Antarctica. Sometimes the river will dry out and leave the pass behind. This kind of pass is called a wind gap, although wind gaps aren't actually formed by wind erosion. The last way that a mountain pass can form is by the action of glaciers. Glaciers are basically rivers made of ice. They flow much slower than rivers, but they also have much greater power to erode. Glaciers often flow down the roots of former streams, so the kind of passes they create are similar to dual stream gaps and water gaps. They're just much wider and flatter, which makes them much more navigable. Snow is also less affected by rain shadows than rain is. You're more likely to find glaciers on both sides of a mountain than you are to find streams, so dual glacier passes are more common than dual stream passes. The Gap of Rohan is probably a water gap since the River Isen flows through the middle. Judging by the way it's depicted in the films, it also seems to have been glaciated at some point in the past. It's extremely wide and flat. In fact, the Gap of Rohan is about the best case scenario for a water gap in terms of ease of navigation. You see, an ideal mountain pass is shaped like what mathematicians call a topographic saddle, mountains on two sides, flat ground on the other two. A topographic saddle has an ideal route through the centre with a high point in the middle. The Gap of Rohan seems to be a very flat saddle which barely gains any elevation at all. Most mountain passes aren't nearly so flat, so even the ideal route through the pass might be very high and snowy. I really recommend The Nameless Day by Sarah Douglas, the first part of her Crucible trilogy, which is a historical fantasy set in 14th century Europe. Douglas put a lot of research into what it was like to cross the Alps between Italy and Germany in that time period, and it's a really harrowing read. Most fantasy worlds seem to assume that mountain passes can be found pretty easily. If you need to cross a mountain range, there'll be a navigable pass somewhere not too far out of the way. But this is actually a bit of Western-centric bias. Most English-language fantasy authors assume that mountain passes are very common because they're very common in North America and Europe. But North America and Europe mostly owe that to the Ice Age. Over the last 2.5 million years or so, there's been quite a lot of ice on the Earth. It's shrinking at the moment thanks to a combination of solar cycles, changes to the Earth's orbit and rotation, and anthropogenic climate change. But at the periods of maximum ice, quite a lot of Europe and North America were frozen over. About 25,000 years or so, the last glacial maximum, the ice sheets reached as far south as New York in North America and Berlin in Europe, even further than that in mountainous areas. All those really thick glaciers created a lot of mountain passes which the people of Europe and North America exploit today. On continents which weren't so heavily affected by the Ice Age, there aren't nearly so many mountain passes. That isn't just a bias which hits fantasy writers either. The first white settlers in Australia had a horrendously difficult time crossing the Blue Mountains to the west of Sydney, even though it's an incredibly small mountain range by European standards with a maximum elevation of less than 1,200 metres. The problem was that the settlers kept expecting to find nice broad mountain passes like they were used to in Europe, so they kept looking for streams and valleys which went from one side of the mountains to the other. But Australia wasn't heavily glaciated during the last ice age, so those mountain passes simply weren't there. There are a few water gaps in the Great Dividing Range, but none of them are especially wide, and none of them are particularly close to Sydney or the Blue Mountains. You see, if you can't go around a mountain using a pass, you need to go over it using a ridgeline, a path between a series of peaks or flat areas. Most mountains have some kind of ridgelines, and following ridgelines is central to the art of mountaineering, but actually finding one which is wide and flat enough to be navigable is the difficult part. The first successful crossing of the Blue Mountains by white settlers was accomplished by Gregory Blaxland in 1813, who hit upon the bright idea of following ridgelines. The first road across the mountains followed Blaxland's route, and the Great Western Highway and Western Railway out of Sydney still follow that route today. Of course, the local Aboriginals knew perfectly well that you had to follow the ridgelines and they crossed the Blue Mountains all the time, but points to Blaxland for figuring it out independently, I guess. The Pass of Caradhras definitely seems to be some kind of ridgeline that the Fellowship has to follow, but we can't tell as much from this ridgeline from its depiction in the books and films as we can from the depiction of the Gap of Rohan. There are lots of different ways that ridgelines can form, and all we really see of Caradhras is a narrow path beset by horrible snowfalls. Whatever the case, it definitely seems like crossing Caradhras is a pretty serious bit of mountaineering. My general lesson for this episode is that if the characters in a fantasy story have to cross a mountain range, it's not quite so easy as ambling through a convenient pass. Not every mountain range is guaranteed to have passes, and even if it does, you shouldn't expect them to be a walk in the park. In fantasy stories, a lot of mountain passes seem to be a hangout for thieves and bandits who take advantage of the bottleneck in traffic to rob passing caravans. But you don't need thieves and bandits to make a mountain pass threatening. Passes can be threatening enough by themselves. Of course, in the end, the Fellowship of the Ring don't use the Gap of Rohan or the Pass of Caradhras. They travel through the mines of Moria, and we'll be looking at the geology of Moria next time on Fantasy Cartography. That's it for this week, but please stay until after the credits for the unrelated interesting fact of the day. You can find full scripts and an Ask Me Anything box at fantasycartography.tumblr.com. You can like my page on Facebook, and you can follow me on Twitter. You can also email your questions to fantasycartography@iinet.net.au. Until next time, may your fantasy be cartographic and your cartography be fantastical. Japan is a very mountainous place with a lot of passes that have winding roads running through them. The famous Japanese street racing scene actually began with races down these passes, and the Tokyo Drift style of street racing is a translation of pass racing into an urban environment. It's reached the point where some English-speaking street racing enthusiasts think that the word toge, the Japanese word for a mountain pass, is actually their word for street racing. Bye!